My name is Kimo Ayun. I am the chair of the President's Committee to Build Campus Unity. To begin, I have a task for you. There are people still coming in. There are seats that are open in the middle. If you could do me a favor and people on the outside squeeze together so that we can make some of those other seats available to people coming in. Or move all the way to one end, some way so we can get rid of some of that space. Okay, thank you. It is clear that you can follow directions. We're here today. It really started last year when the Faculty Senate Executive Committee asked the President to bring together the campus in a convocation to talk about difficult conversations. During that convocation last year, we gathered a group of people, faculty, staff, students, administrators, and it was very clear that they wanted to keep the conversation together and keep going this year. We were fortunate at the same time that the One Book program was bringing a speaker that was very relevant to the topic. And so we contacted them and asked them whether or not they'd like to join forces for today's convocation. It happened because of a couple of people in the One Book program especially, and I'd like to point out Sherry Meyer and Helen Lee Keller, who's actually behind the curtain right now, but we'll clap for her. This is a very interesting topic today, and to start off officially the convocation, I'm about to introduce the provost, but before that, one other group that I would like to recognize who is really important in being able to get the word out, Dr. Tim Howard from the Department of Communication Studies, who is one of our PR professors. Along with his roughly 100 students, have been phenomenal. We have a virtual presence that's unmatched, and if you see them around here and they identify themselves, please thank them. So right now, to officially open the convocation, I would like to welcome Provost Joe Sheely to the podium.
Thank you, Professor Ayun. Great crowd. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to those of you who are in the overflow crowd. This is a big event and a very special one. This is our second annual University Convocation. As you know, President Gonzalez isn't here today, and he asked me to share his best wishes for today. You know this is special to him. He would be here. In fact, we kind of had to tie him down. You can't be here, you just had surgery. He had minor surgery. He calls it minor. I don't think it was that minor, but he's going to be laid up for a little bit, and will be back with us fairly soon. But his recovery is going very well. He would be thrilled to see the size of the crowd today, and to know that we've got people in the Hind Auditorium and Orchard and all the other places as we're experiencing overflow crowds. Your attendance today is really a credit to the commitment we have toward a shared sense of community at Sacramento State. In fact, since you were just clapping, why don't you take a minute, we're clapping for a few. Clap for everybody once here. Everybody who came out today. Because this does take commitment from an entire campus community to make it work. Let me take a moment to recognize the members of the President's Committee to Build Campus Unity, and they have worked exceptionally hard, and a lot of people besides them, have worked very hard, who won't get the public recognition they deserve. But this is the group that really, really focused and really put this together. So I'm going to say their names, ask them to sit until I'm done, and have them all stand at once. And then please give them an even louder round of applause than you gave yourselves. Let me start with, Professor Kimo Ayun, who was just up here. Margarita Bertha Avila, Tim Fong, Janet Hecksch, Greg Mark, Steve Perez, Dean Vanessa Sheeran, Carlin Sturr-Pollock, who's the president of University Staff Assembly, Laura Gonzalez, president of Associated Students Incorporated, and Liz Redford, ASI vice president of Student Affairs, Don Taylor, assistant vice president for Academic Affairs, and Carol Hayashino, who's worked so hard, vice president for University Advancement. So I'd like all those faculty members and others please to stand up. Please give them a huge round of applause. One of the recommendations from the last convocation was that if we are serious about strengthening unity on this campus, it couldn't be just a one-time event. We have to commit to continued events that have us dealing with difficult, not bad, difficult questions and issues. It needs to be a recurring, a continuing commitment. And I think especially when you're done today, you will agree that it's worth the time and the effort. So today we're going to have an open and honest discussion of racism, not academically, not generically, not historically, but frankly, for what it means on this campus, especially, and what it means in the Sacramento region. We will examine how we perceive each other and how we discuss, and maybe more importantly, how we do not discuss certain issues and certain problems. I hope that when we leave today, all of us will have a deeper understanding of how our perceptions affect all aspects of our lives, here, at work, at home, and in our communities. It's now my distinct privilege to introduce today's keynote speaker. Michele Norris is an award-winning journalist, an author, and one of the world's preeminent voices. That part you know. If you listen to NPR, you know her voice. She's worked at newspapers, in television, and for the last 9 years has been the host of NPR's All Things Considered. And all of you Twitter users know, you probably know anyway, that she's a very active tweeter. Ms. Norris is a perfect choice to help us begin today's discussions. Anyone who has heard her at her work knows that her ability to listen is just as important as her voice in telling a story. She's particularly adept at encouraging people to open up and share the parts of their lives and observations that are most relevant to our world. In fact, I just saw her do that with a group of 20 of us at lunch. She is very good at this. Whether we're talking about a presidential candidate, a reporter in the field, or an oyster processor just trying to make a living after last year's oil spill in the Gulf. Her first book, The Grace of Silence, was published in 2010. I'm very much looking forward to hearing her talk of it today. Friends and colleagues, students and staff, please help me welcome Michele Norris.
Wow, look at this room. This is incredible. I am so happy to be here. Good afternoon. Now we can get a little bit more robust than that, can't we? Can we try that one more time? Good afternoon. There we go. There we go. Provost Sheely, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. You actually mentioned one of my favorite conversations, that oysterman. who is trying to figure out his way forward. It's sometimes the conversations with the newsmakers are the ones that get all the attention, but it's those conversations that really live on. Thanks to everyone who made this possible. This is such an honor to be here with you today, to talk to you, to listen to you, to share my story with you, to learn from all of you, because this one read experience is something that's truly amazing. You may not recognize that, but this is unique. I mean, a lot of campuses do one read programs or common read programs, but they usually read and discuss. You're doing so much more than that. You're actually doing more than just discussing the book. You're living it. You're talking about it. You're creating art. You're creating things that are tactile. I have learned so much, and I've only been here for half a day. It really is an honor to be with you. I host this little show on the radio called All Things Considered, and some of you may know me from that. Particularly the young people may know me because you are prisoners of public radio. You were forced to listen on the way to soccer or piano. Your parents made you listen when you were at the kitchen table doing your homework. But you're better for it. And in my introduction, it was noted that I have a certain tone when I speak, and I always chuckle when I hear that because I have young children myself. And they are always saying to me, "Mommy, can we have the radio voice?" And so I have to tell them, "Clean your room. Then you get the radio voice." But not until then. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about telling stories and sharing stories and capturing histories and being courageous. It sounds like a lot, but it really is. It's all connected, and we'll cover a lot of ground. But I think we're going to take the beginning steps of a journey that I have a feeling will continue to percolate in interesting ways long after all of you leave this room. I wrote this book called The Grace of Silence, and I've been carrying it around with me. And this copy in particular, it is my inaugural copy, and it's been signed by so many people, and people have handed me stories, and it still is a surprise to me when I pick it up and look at it because of those three words, I guess, that follow the title, The Grace of Silence, a family memoir. And it's surprising to me because the word memoir was not in my mind when I sat down and started working on a book. This was not supposed to be a memoir. You've heard this described as an accidental memoir. I intended to write about how other people talked about race. Other people. I was going to listen to other people talk about race in their most private spaces because I thought something interesting was going on in America, that despite all the talk about America sliding into a post-racial status, that it seemed to me that we weren't done, at least not based on what I was hearing. That despite all the talk about America becoming a post-racial nation, there was this really interesting and highly animated and sometimes prickly conversation about race. And I heard a version of it in Studio 2A. But I also knew that it was playing out in really interesting ways outside of my earshot, in college campuses and college dormitories and beauty shops and in bodegas and strip malls and in corporate headquarters. And I wanted to put an ear to that. That was my intent, was to travel around the country and listen to people. And what happened is when I started listening to the people in my own family, the people I love so much and the people I thought I knew so well, I realized that there was this really interesting and animated and somewhat prickly conversation about race in my own family that was completely new to me. All of a sudden, all of these older people in my family in particular were shedding stories. They were just serving stuff up that they had never said before. It was like historic indigestion. Stuff was just suddenly coming up. And the more I learned, the more I realized, whoa, wait a minute. I thought I knew my story. And I thought that, we were kind of an ordinary family, an ordinary African-American family, ordinary to the point of being almost dull. And in fact, that was my parents' intent. They were just regular folk. They were both postal workers. They were modest. We're from Minnesota, so they were particularly modest. And if you listen to Prairie Home Companion, you know what I'm talking about. And I didn't understand that they lived lives that they had locked away, and that I was shaped by some of those things that they experienced but never talked about. I learned that I was shaped not just by all the things that were obvious, but shaped by this sort of silent force field in our house, shaped by the weight of silence. And I'm just going to read a little passage from the beginning of the book because I think it will help you understand a little bit of what I experienced. You see, I always understood that my racial identity had largely been forged by the sum of experiences in my lifetime, and that my formative memories flow through my parents' lives, from their struggles and tribulations, their triumphs and celebrations, their dignity found through a hard day's work, the devotion of our worship, the places we lived, and above all, the constant expectation captured by one word: rise. Rise and shine. Rise to the occasion. Rise above it all. No matter what, move forward, never backward, always onward and upward. And if you ever feel like you're at the end of your rope, tie a knot and hold on until you can start climbing again. For all of our lives, we were told, keep your eye on the prize, stay strong, keep committed, focus on the fight for justice and equality, set your sights on excellence and opportunity, don't let up, don't look back, don't slow down, ignore the slights and the slurs and the laws that try to keep you from achieving your goals, always keep the prize in mind, see it, smell it, feel it. Our parents armed us with what they thought we needed: strength, courage, and a touch of indignation, but just a touch. I was shaped by the advice and admonitions that rained down on me. I have always known that. What I did not know until I began this project is that I was also shaped by the weight of my parents' silence. Silence about things that were quite obvious when they happened. Silence about small things that were actually part of larger histories. Many of you have already read the book, so you already understand some of the things I learned. I was surprised not just by the fact of these things, but by the idea that these things were so well known at the time, but then had been largely forgotten. It was like everyone took a silent oath to just stop talking about it, and that history was lost as a result. I learned, for instance, that my family were blockbusters. I grew up in this very integrated community on the south side of Minneapolis, this rainbow community, and I didn't realize until I started digging in and working on this book that the community was integrated because my family integrated it. They were the first black family to move on their particular block on the south side of Minneapolis. Now, to help you understand what this meant at that time, and this still happens in places, there were lines of demarcation that were never stated but were widely understood. People who looked like one thing lived on this side, and people who looked like something else lived on that side. And that line would sort of move. And in South Minneapolis, it was 38th Street, then it was 40th Street, then it was 42nd Street, then it was 46th Street, and then it got close to 48th Street. Now, you don't understand the geography of Minneapolis here in California, but after 48th Street, there is a parkway. It's called the Minnehaha Parkway. And the big concern is that if people got too close to the Minnehaha Parkway, people of color, people with darker skins, would jump the parkway, and then, ooh, who knows what would happen then. So when my parents decided to purchase that home in the 4800 block of Oakland Avenue, which was hard up against the parkway, there was a lot of consternation. I only know this now because my parents started talking about it. My sisters, who are older than me, remember some of this, but my parents just didn't talk about it. And in learning this, I realized that many of the friends whose homes I visited all the time were actually part of the families that gave my parents, a rather rough reception when they first moved in. So even though I spent my childhood playing with Barbies and Legos in their basement, I realized that their parents were not particularly warm to mine. I realized, thanks to the research that one of my as a good friend that I went to high school with did. She actually dug up letters, and these are some of the things that continue to pour out after I actually did the research for the book. I'm still collecting stories. She went and found the letters that were written and discovered that many of them had wrote letters to the editor, letters to the lawmakers, describing the family that moved in as guerrillas, describing their fears about pickpocketing and purse snatchings, even though my parents were postal workers. Why would they go there? But that was the fear that prevailed at that time. The more I learned about this, I realized it was not just that my family was involved in a little history that could easily be forgotten because they stopped talking about it. They were part of a much larger history that had actually consumed large parts of the city. You know, it's hard to imagine the kinds of things that consume us one day right now just being forgotten a few decades later, but that's what happens when histories are locked away. They get lost. They just sort of drift away. I learned through documents that continue to pour out in my family's community that they were there was so much consternation about families moving into the neighborhood that there was an entire commission, an interracial commission in Minneapolis. And I just want to share this with you because it helps you understand, and certainly helped me understand how unusual this was, that all of this had just been forgotten. When my parents moved into their home, it was not long after the state of Minnesota produced a document. It's called The Negro as a Neighbor in Minnesota. Now, you just see a photocopy of it. In the actual leaflet, the letters Negro and neighbor are orange, so they stand out to let you know what they're talking about. The governor's interracial commission in Minnesota was distributing this because there was so much consternation about people of color moving into neighborhoods. And it notes, every good man wants a home. It's interesting, they didn't mention the women. I guess we want a good home too, but not just a home, but a suitable home where his wife and children can live in pleasant, safe, and healthy surroundings. It asks, what about the American Negro? Ambitions, hopes, and aspirations know no racial boundaries. Since Negroes are now beginning to receive a larger share of the national income, it is understandable that they, like other Americans, desire a good home, sometimes a new home, in a pleasant neighborhood. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but I am going to read you slight excerpts. It asks the question, where does he live now? With some exceptions, the Negro is forced by the customs of segregation to live in the older and more dilapidated sections of our cities where the houses are old, the rents excessively high, the streets neglected, and where there are few trees and little grass. It goes on to say that it asked another question, why do the white citizens segregate him? Some think that shabby housing is a racial trait. Yet the persons who think thus have not seriously examined the facts. Again, remember, this is a government document. Most of the houses the Negro occupies were old and deteriorated when he was permitted to move into them, and now because of segregation they are overcrowded. Some whites fear that a Negro's entrance into the neighborhood will cause the financial value of their own property to drop, and such charges are often encouraged by a few unprincipled real estate operators. Much, however, depends upon the market, and the cause is often panic on the part of the white group who rush to put their property on the market. Sound familiar? If you've read the book, you know that's exactly what happened. Sane and thoughtful community discussion and action could prevent such fluctuations in property values. It goes on to note that the nation was founded on ideals, this nation. And because people believed in them, they made them work. The ideal of interracial housing is now slowly being realized, it says, in the cities and in our state. They were talking about Minnesota. There are some Negroes and some whites living peacefully. They note that to many white persons, these paragraphs may be disturbing. Candidly, the expression of these concepts in actual living will be difficult. Yet the real fulfillment of the Ten Commandments has also been difficult it notes, an American society improved only when citizens did the difficult thing. And they noted that the difficult thing in this case was actually to talk about this. To talk about it. So simple, and yet that's what kept people apart. So simple, an idea that it stunned me that this was all going on, and yet no one talked about it. A history that was lost. And this happened in every big and even small revelation that I made. When I discovered the work that my grandmother did, my grandmother Ione, when she worked as an itinerant Aunt Jemima, I have since learned that there was an army of these women who did this work. I now know this because I've been on radio programs where people have called in and said, my grandmother did the same thing, my aunt so-and-so did the same thing. I now have pictures that have been sent to me. And I know so much more about a history that if you lived in that period in the late 1940s and early 1950s, you would know about this because they were everywhere. They were visiting strip malls and shopping centers and Piggly Wigglies and Kroger's doing these pancake demonstrations. You might wonder, pancake demonstrations? How hard can that be? You're actually just talking about adding water and stirring up something, right? It's not that hard. But at the time, America was entering an era of convenience cooking. And so the idea of using pancake mix, which you all have taken for granted, was something that was completely new and different. And when my grandmother was out doing this work, she was doing a little bit of reconnaissance for the Quaker Oats Company to help them understand whether people would accept this idea. My grandmother Ione was not a large woman, but she was very large in presence. She was what you would call a committee woman. And if you have those in your family, you know what I mean. They're the people who are always running things, telling you what to do, carrying a clipboard, fussing at you. And my grandmother was very efficient at it. And the woman that I remember was always receiving keys to the city for this and that, and she dressed in such a way that you understood that she was someone, she who had to be obeyed. And so she would wear these tight little ensembles. And by tight, I don't mean tight fitting, I mean tight because they were like really well put together. And she would dress in such a way that it was almost like Garanimals for adults. So if it was a light blue day, everything would be light blue. The skirt and the jacket would be light blue. The brooch would have some sapphire light blueness in it. And she would have a little scarf that she would attach to her purse, because the purses then weren't like the big ridiculous bags that we carry now. They were like really cute little triangular things. And she would tie it, and then she would take it off and she would tie it under her chin. When I learned about her work, again in this period of historic indigestion, I had to imagine her in a completely different way. I had to imagine her not with that smart scarf tied Jackie O style under her chin, but I had to imagine her with her scarf pulled up behind her head and pulled up here and tied on the top of her forehead. You wouldn't even really call it a scarf, would you? What would you call it? Head rag, do-rag, kerchief. I had to imagine that. And I had to imagine also the hard bargain that she made with herself. This is a woman who was, I'm not going to say she was vain, but she did like to look good. So I had to imagine what it must have been like for her to sit in front of a mirror and adjust that headscarf. I had to imagine what it must have been like for her to pull on that hoop skirt and tie that apron behind her back. Now, how many of you can envision Aunt Jemima? How many of you use Aunt Jemima pancake mix? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, you have to erase the image of Aunt Jemima that's on the box right now out of your head, okay? Because that's not what I'm talking about. Aunt Jemima that's on the box now looks like she shops at Macy's. Okay, she's got it going on. She gets her hair done on Tuesdays. She has pearls. She plays canasta on, Wednesday nights. That's not what I'm talking about. My grandmother was doing this work in the late 1940s and early 1950s. At that time, the Aunt Jemima that was on the box looked like a slave woman, someone you might call Mammy. Now, you understand why the people in my family decided not to talk about that, because there's a lot wrapped up in that. And they didn't want to talk to me about it. I had to work hard to pull this history out of them. My mother would say things like, talk about this when I'm gone. She'd put me out, literally put me out of the room, and at one point put me out of her condo when I was trying to talk to her about this. But I had to understand more about this woman that I thought I knew, my grandmother. I had to understand why she did this and how she did it. And I got lucky in that I was able to find newspaper clippings of her doing her work. And as I explain in the book, I learned how she did her work. I learned that, yes, she wore the uniform, but she refused to use the slave patois. Because in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Aunt Jemima Pancake Mix was one of the two largest advertisers in the nation. So if you had picked up a newspaper or a magazine, you would be confronted with Aunt Jemima. And the ads were beautiful. They were beautifully illustrated, and they were huge. And they had all this text with them that explained to you what life was like for Aunt Jemima. All this was made up. I mean, she's a totally mythic character, but they were almost like little novels. They explained that she lived on Colonel Higby's plantation, and her pancakes had seemingly magical powers. I mean, in some of the ads, they would have Confederate soldiers would come stumbling out of the forest, and they would see a slave cabin in the distance, and they would see smoke rising from the chimney, and they would drag themselves to this little slave cabin, and they would go inside, and there would be Aunt Jemima making pancakes, and amazingly, she would say, sit down and have some. And she would serve them these pancakes, and they would emerge strengthened for the fight because her pancakes were so delicious and nutritious and easy. Just add water and stir. But in all of those ads, Aunt Jemima spoke with a certain patois, a slave patois, to let you know that she was not particularly educated. The catchphrase was, eyes in town, honey. Well, my grandmother, I discovered, took the job, but said, I'm not going to use the patois. When she went out to these county fairs and Rotary breakfasts and Knights of Columbus activities and served her pancakes, she spoke as if she was educated because she was. She would sing gospel songs because she wanted people to know that she was a woman of God that was important to her. And she would focus on the children because she thought if those children would carry forward a positive image of a woman of color, that might color their world or their impression of it. And in this big fat book that I carry around, I have had people who met her sign this book, who remember seeing her at breakfast. One woman held her hand in a fair in Michigan. My grandmother had a 6-state region. She traveled to Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Iowa, and Michigan at a time when women didn't really travel. So that was another thing I learned about her. Women didn't travel, and black women certainly didn't travel. And she was traveling all over and treated like a celebrity when she arrived. When I learned this, it made sense to me. I thought, well, that is sort of the woman I know. Speaking in that diction, I could hear it because my grandmother had, she was, and you know these people, you maybe are educated by some of them here on this campus. She spoke in such a way that you heard every single consonant, particularly when she was upset. You got everything. And when I was a kid, when we would all be at her house on Saturday mornings, amazingly often having pancakes, my cousins and I, we would all be there, and she would sometimes fuss at us. If we were talking about how we were thinking about doing something or fixing to do something, she would say, oh, whoa, wait a minute. It's cold outside. Let's invite Mr. G inside so he can attach himself to the back of that word. So you're talking about how you're thinking about doing something or fixing. In fact, how about you're preparing to do something? So that rang true to me. And all of it in the end was a gift that I was able to give to my family. Because we took a history that was difficult and we held it up and examined it. And realized that yes, there were portions of that didn't go down easy. But we also learned something from it. We learned that she was somewhat subversive in the way that she did her work. We learned that there was honor in how she did her work. How many of us have had to do jobs that we don't really stomach well? But she did it anyway, and she did it in a way that lifted herself up, but also lifted her people up. And that really was an incredible gift to give back to people who tried to run away from that history. You know, history is an interesting thing in America because America is full of people who have interesting histories, but they're often unexamined. And history is something that gets lost if you don't actually go back and try to track it down. I learned that also in examining my father's history, which was, I guess, the biggest tent pole in this book. And this was the thing that was most surprising to me as someone who considers all things on a daily basis, because there is a big part of American history that I guess I had not spent enough time considering. And that was the treatment of World War II veterans. You know, when I learned about my father's incident, if we can call it that, I learned not just about him, but about what happened to American veterans of color during World War II and immediately after World War II. And again, it's a story that's spelled out in the book. It's simply this, that my father, upon returning to Birmingham, Alabama, is trying to enter a public building. He was stopped by police officers. He asserted his right to enter that public building. A scuffle ensued. Policeman's gun discharged, and he was wounded. He was shot in the leg. Now imagine discovering that someone in your family, someone close to you, was shot in the leg, but you never knew about it. Imagine if that was your father and he never told you. You'd be surprised. Imagine if you thought, well, maybe he told the older people in my family. He hadn't told them either. He hadn't told your older siblings, hadn't told your cousins. And then you discover that he hadn't told his wife, your mother, that in all the years and all the intimacy of marriage, he never talked about that. He carried this big weight around all his life, never talked about it. And I had to understand not just why he kept a secret, but also why he did certain things in that evening. Why would he stand up to a police officer? This is Birmingham, Alabama. For a man of color, for a black man, even if you were smelling yourself after just being honorably discharged from the Navy, to stand up to a white police officer in Birmingham, Alabama in 1946 was to invite a special kind of trouble, and yet he did. I had to understand that. And what I learned was that he was part of a generation of men who went through an incredible transformation in the war. They went overseas and participated in this fight for for democracy overseas. Excuse me, they fought against human rights violations overseas, fought for democracy overseas, and then came back to this country with a kind of crazy idea that they might get a taste of democracy back home. And America, on the whole, was not ready. My father, as a young man, returned to Birmingham, Alabama, along with a legion of World War II veterans. Many of them were recruited from Birmingham specifically because there was a high school in Birmingham called Parker, which was much exalted. It was a school that was known for excellence, and when the Navy was trying to look for men of color, they went to Parker. So there was a disproportionate number of veterans that had returned to Birmingham after the war. And because of that, Birmingham became the epicenter of a voting rights campaign that was centered around these returning veterans. The building that my father was trying to enter that evening was a building that housed doctors' offices and attorneys' offices and social clubs and the like. And he was entering a building in the evening, and the evening is when they often had classes for returning veterans. Those veterans were taking classes because they were trying to learn as much about the Constitution. They were trying to learn as much about the Constitution as they could because if they wanted to register to vote, they had to pass tests. And the tests required that they proved that they understood and could recite specific portions of the Constitution that were pointed out by the registrar. Now imagine that. Your generation, you go, you fill out a form, you get a registration card. But imagine if someone asked you to recite part of the Constitution. Imagine if they asked you to dictate how many suds are in a bar of soap or how many flakes are in a box of soap powder. These were the kinds of questions that they had to answer. I discovered that my father was fortunate in that he was only wounded, but he was fortunate in many other ways because this happened in the first 6 weeks of 1946. It's February 7th, 1946. In the first 6 weeks of 1946, I discovered upon doing my research that there were half a dozen returning veterans who were shot by police officers, shot and killed by police officers in and around Birmingham. The more I knew, the more I had to learn, and the more I learned, the more I had to know. I discovered that that was just the beginning of the story in 1946, that throughout the remainder of the year, black veterans were beaten, burned, maimed, castrated, lynched, and blinded. It was the blinding of a veteran named Isaac Woodard, again, a story spelled out in the book, that so moved Harry Truman that he made the decisive steps after that to integrate the armed forces. Now, you probably know about Isaac Woodard because many of you have read the book, but I've traveled to almost 60 cities, and usually when I mention Isaac Woodard's name, I often ask people, have you ever heard of him? And I never get more than 2 people who raise their hands. This is incredible, because Isaac Woodard has a place in history, an important place in history. His story led Harry Truman to change this country, to change the face of this country, to integrate the armed forces. People don't know him, and if you had lived in 1946, it would be hard to escape that story. The trial of the officers who beat Isaac Woodard so badly that his eyes were pulverized and he lost his sight was huge news. It was front page news not just in South Carolina and Aiken and Batesburg, but all across the country. It was huge news in the International Herald Tribune. It was huge news overseas. It was huge news when Orson Welles decided to editorialize about this on the radio. It was huge news when 60,000 people gathered at Lewiston Stadium with Milton Berle and Pearl Bailey and Arlo Guthrie. It was huge news when Albert Einstein wrote letters on his behalf, and yet lost to history. Lost to history because everybody stopped talking about it. People ask me all the time when I discovered this history if I'm angry. And maybe it's because I'm my father's daughter and I inherited some of his naturally sunny disposition, but I don't land at anger at the end of the day. I land at a place closer to wonder. Because I realized I was raised by people who had good reason to wake up every day mad at the world. And they decided not to be mad at the world. They had every reason to feed us, the next generation, a steady diet of disappointment and frustration, and they decided not to do that. Instead of giving us their anger, they gave us their ambitions. They decided not to share with us the worst of their history because they wanted the best for us. Remember that word I talked about at the beginning, rise? How will your children rise if you fill up their pockets with tales of woe? How will they take flight if you put boulders in their pockets? That's incredible. That's why the word grace is in the title of the book. That is an incredible act of grace. Think about all the conflicts that you read about in the paper, that you hear about on the radio, because I know you all listen to the radio, that you talk about in your classrooms, and how much of it is historic in nature. And think about how different things would be if people didn't pass on ancestral hatreds. If people didn't pass on all of their animosities, if they found a way to swallow that and give their children grace and give them ambition. Now, I know you might ask, okay, so you benefited from grace while you're talking about it. Why did you put it in the street? Why did you take this public? You know, I understand that I benefited from that grace, but I also know that I benefit greatly from knowing my history. I appreciate where we are in America, even with the difficult history that I've uncovered. In fact, I appreciate it more because I understand it. I feel like I've given my children a gift because they know that, you know what, bad things will happen because they happen to all of us, but it doesn't have to define you. You choose how you define yourself, no matter what happens to you. I realize that my history is part of my wealth, not the wealth that's in the bank, but the wealth that's in my heart. And I realize that I might not want to put pebbles or boulders in my children's pocket, but I think it's okay to put something light in their pocket, pearls of wisdom. Because maybe then they're grounded. Maybe then they appreciate their history. And maybe then they are less likely to be blown off course by the sort of the winds of history that blow, or the forces that will come their way and try to blow them off course. I hope that in reading the book, you all think about your own histories and the stories that you can capture, not just the capital H history, but the small histories that are all around us. Where did your people come from? How did your community get to look the way it does? Are there stories in your family that you don't know? You know, I was raised by a generation that saw much but said little. You're a generation that says everything online, in constant motion. And somewhere in between that is a wonderful opportunity for you to maybe reach back to another generation and capture some of their histories. You can do that over the holidays when you gather as a family. You can do that in your classrooms here. But capture your history. It's so important. It is your wealth. It will lead you forward. It is a beacon if you take the time to find it. I wanted to talk to you about history, but I also wanted to spend just a little bit of time before we break talking about the conversation that you're engaged in on this campus. Because it's historic in a sense also, in that you're capturing something and hopefully codifying it in some way. And one of the ways we can do that is through this little thing that's called the Race Card Project. I think every single one of you had one of these on your chair when you came in. And what I've asked you to do is to think about race, and think about diversity, and think about ethnicity, and think about identity. And think about how you would express it if you only had one sentence, and if that sentence only had 6 words. I'd like you to give this some thought. It's not really a pop quiz. It would be great if you could fill these out and leave them with me. You don't have to do it today. You can always send them to me in the mail, or send them to me via email, or tweet them to me, because I am active on Twitter. And I encourage you to actually go to the website where I post these. There are hundreds of them. I have thousands of them that have come in from all over the country, and now from all over the world, thanks to social media. And to look at them and to understand how other people live, what other people experience, the views from someone else's standpoint. You can actually kind of hear the conversation on race and experience it if you take the time to go through these. And there's something special that happens when you actually say them out loud, because what you realize is that as people express their truths about race and ethnicity and diversity and identity, they're actually seemingly having a conversation. In many cases, it seems like they're talking to each other. And I'd like to give you a sense of that, because when you read them out loud, it is to hear the national conversation on race. And so it sort of ends where I began, because I wanted to eavesdrop on this national conversation about race. I wound up writing an accidental memoir, and here I am swimming in what it was that I saw at the beginning. And this is sort of what it sounds like. As you listen, remember that these are all 6-word truths, 6-word thoughts on race, ethnicity, identity. Here goes. Race. It matters, like it or not. Much ado about nothing. We are still a racist society. Race does not exist by itself. Race is everything, but it's nothing. Today's soft segregation harms everyone. Soul has no color. Black wears me wherever I go. I admit to unconscious racial bias. Does not define who I am. A costume mistaken for an actor. Who I am not. Racism is a shackle. I broke mine. Sometimes racism is self-imposed. Step on backs to raise yourself, still working harder than others are. The point of it all, power. Get your feet off our necks. Blacks complain constantly despite obvious progress, but I voted for Barack Obama. Colors run together. Why can't people? I hear my grandfather's hateful words. White man vilified what I do. Racism is promoted by the NAACP. Racism I inherited breaks my heart. Think Dr. Seuss and the Sneetches. Race to the border. And the person who wrote that crossed it out and said, no, make that race is the border. Blacks and Latinos practice it too. Diversity don't count if it's white. Pay no attention to my packaging. I am still not from Vietnam. Please stop saying I'm articulate. That always gets applause. See me, see black, see nothing. I am fortunate to be Caucasian. I assume black women hate me. Easy to assume I'm guilty. My great-great-grandfather owned slaves. Would Martin Luther King support gay rights? Born colored, children African American. Progress? Can I love who I want? Reason I ended a sweet relationship. A terrible, unnecessary barrier against love. Black woman, white man, golden children. I will not ruin your bloodline. Korean marries Italian in Chinese garden. No one word to describe me. Obama is mixed, black and white. Shamefully, conveniently, own half of me. The hybrids shall inherit the earth. My son is not half, he's double. It all goes downhill after these 6 words, someone wrote. I am not a racist, but let's all hit the reset button. Every now and then I remember. Grandparents passed, new tree, no roots. Terrified, you assume I'm judging you. Civility heals wounds from the past, still the elephant in the room. What a tangled web we wove. Rebecca, black maid, taught me love, the complicated, cruel history of man. No one is born a racist. Sad, I learned, sad and hopeful. What if the world were colorblind? Colorblindness is not goal. Celebrate colors. Let us all live sweetly together. Skin color is God's gift wrapping. Our untold stories keep us separate. Start with kids and mix well. All of those are 6-word truths about race expressed by people with candor and with courage, and with something that I think all of us should remember as we continue these conversations about difficult topics. The goal is to keep the conversation going. It's courageous to admit that it will be difficult, but it's even more courageous to say, even when it gets difficult, I'm going to stay at the table. I'm going to keep the conversation going. And in that sense, maybe we can borrow something from my grandmother. Maybe we can invite that G to come inside the room, and maybe Mr. G can sit on top of the word race. Maybe we can have these conversations with grace and keep that conversation going. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you again to Michele Norris for her inspiring words. My name is Margarita Berta Avila, and I'm also a member of the President's Committee to Build Campus Unity, and also faculty with the College of Education, Bilingual Multicultural Education Department. Our plan for the next 90 minutes is to have an open and honest discussion about the realities and ramifications of race and racism. We hope to create a space in which we can offer with one another a constructive dialogue and have with one another a constructive dialogue. Discussion that will be used to help us build community on our campus this year and beyond. So what the plan is for 7 groups to meet in various rooms in the University Union. To decipher what room you will be attending, please refer to the room listed on the front of your program. It'll say either Ballroom, Delta, Oak, Summit, Walnut, Orchard, or the Hind Auditorium. If you don't have a program, remain in the ballroom and you'll be directed at that point as to where to go. Following the discussion groups, please join